And this week, this is Too Much Seawater. It's chapter 13 in the book. We will do a short tabletop exercise today. This will be our second and I think our final tabletop exercise for the course series. And the slides are in the thing. And then I'll set you guys up for the part quiz as we've done in the last two times. This one, if you notice below, it is open book as usual. And I'm giving everybody 2 weeks to work on the quiz. So the quiz will be open until 6:29 p.m. Eastern on 4/23. So the quiz is going to go between 4/6 and 4/23. This is for those folks that are at the conference or other things in your way, whether it's responses or whatever. A little extra time. Our next quiz isn't until the 3 weeks later, so it's not like quizzes are running up against each other or anything like that. So that's the case. So we're on, as I said, week 9, which is chapter 13. So we'll go ahead and switch over to the book. Michael, can you tell me, can you see the book chapter at this point? You're on your computer, or Jim, or Thomas?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure it's switched when the screens. All right. So so the book wise, this is hey Thomas, this is chapter 13, as I mentioned. We're covering Too Much Seawater, with the exception of tropical storms. That'll be the next one, chapter 14. So this one is just what happens when there's too much seawater. Again, there are some open water, open seas hazards covered, but those are the ones, again, with emergency management impact. So similar to the last chapter, we didn't cover a lot of Great Lakes boating incidents. We're not covering a lot of cruise ship Caribbean accidents or incidents from what's happening. What we are covering is some of the things, for example, of sea level rise. So that has impacts to communities directly, as well as what's happening in the ocean. So there's in land impacts, environmental impacts, all that kind of fun stuff from sea level rise and climate change. In fact, as you can see here, there's a pretty cool quote from President Kennedy. The rising tide lifts all the boats. He was talking about economic benefits of actions in one part of the country impacting the others. Boy, oh boy, that is very relevant to disasters, right? So the disasters that are happening today, these days, right now in the Midwest, how that impacts the communities not only there, but also the rest of the country, from an environmental, from an ecological, and from, of course, an economic. Are there farms that are getting, is this production that's being concerned with auto plants, whatever it is. It's a small world, so to speak, and lots of things are happening. But that other thing about rising tides, it literally rises not only the boats, but the houses, the schools, the hospitals, and everything else in the way. So I'm not going to get in the middle of, and when I was writing this book, certainly the question of climate change being real is out there. I'm not going to get into that particular fight, but I think emergency managers would probably, hopefully, all agree that you have to plan for what if if you're planning for 3-foot waters when it comes to flooding, maybe you should be planning for 6 or 9. It's never the case that we do things just to whatever somebody else tells us. It should be a little bit more, I think, is the way to look at it, or maybe even a lot more. So the thing is a lot of this sometimes can be like the proverbial frog in the water as the water starts to boil, doesn't notice the water's there. These are some of the concerns of too much seawater. If it doesn't happen all at once or suddenly, like it does with a tropical storm, if it's slow, it can be something that is like what they call a gray rhino, right? It's the disaster hazards that are right there. They're giant, but they're coming right at you. But because they're gray, you don't really see them. It's something that you don't see it until it's too late. And that's a quiz question, by the way. So this is the point, that this is just about seawater hazards. Again, I mentioned that the tropical storms are a combination of both freshwater and seawater, because they move their ways into rivers and streams as well, and so therefore they're complex not to mention the whole complexity of adding wind and wave action and things like that makes it much more complicated. We will talk about wind and wave to this chapter a bit, and some of the things that are specifically on the open water in the oceans as well too, when there are emergency management impacts. The usual caveat chapter about investigations at this point. I think you guys can all have read that multiple times. I won't go over it again. And then next up is the sort of alphabetic listing of hazards, and we've got the boating hazards, the whole thing about what are the water related hazards that are caused. So the idea of certainly a ship having a problem or an oil rig having a problem is the case. But if there's a rogue wave, for example, hitting a ship, or other things, that could be the boating hazard. On the ocean open water threat is what generates the hazards for boats and ships, and potentially oil rigs and things are also technically vessels as well too. Then we've got the bridges collapsing over the ocean waterways. This is where your example from the Key Scott Bridge, Francis Scott Key, sorry, get that right, bridge, and certainly I have some other examples that I had put in here before when the substructures and other things get impacted. So the damage to the bridge itself, and again, of course, the collapse of a bridge like it was in Baltimore is massively significant along multiple areas, community lifelines, ESFs, RSFs, the whole 9 yards. Then we have alphabetically again, desalination. So the idea that folks have been switching or converting, I should say, water into seawater into drinking water, so salt water into potable water for many years. The process of that does actually create water. Sort of there's the desalination process has a discharge water, and that discharge water is not necessarily fully capable of it's like when you pull it out, you have like super salted water basically, and where that goes, that can have some impact on marine life if it's put back into the ocean, if it's tried to be brought onto land for turning into plain salt or some other thing that can impact the environment on the land where plants are, and how this it is effectively wastewater from the desalination process. A lot of good footnotes here. Again, things that are happening in a lot of Middle Eastern countries where they really significantly rely on desalination for their freshwater supply. Next up is dunes. So sand dunes, sandbars, kind of the same thing in the sense that how they're impacted, how they stop wave action from hitting the onshore communities. So the threats and hazards to dunes and their impacts can be significant, and replenishing them, fixing them. If any of you folks are in shore communities, you can imagine, you probably know, I should say, what the efforts are in place and how it has to be a complete solution. If all it takes is missing 1 or 2 towns along the shore, and suddenly the dune structure doesn't work, and then the water still ends up coming in if that doesn't get done. Lots of fights going on. I read about it almost every month or so in the paper or the news or whatever it is that talks about communities from Sandy, from 13 plus years ago, dealing with still dune replenishment and Army Corps of Engineers projects. Next up is the intercoastal waterway, and this is something some people may not be aware of or familiar with, but there's similar to a highway. Like in an interstate highway, there is an intercoastal waterway. So from Massachusetts all the way up in the northern part on the eastern seaboard, all the way down through around Florida and over to Texas, there are a number of, I guess it may also be inland as well too. I'm not sure how all that works, but I'm not a boater, so I'm not going to be able to tell you all of the stuff on this. A number of rivers, canals, bays, lagoons, etc. These are all deep water in the sense that the most the shallowest point is 6 feet on this. So otherwise, it's clear paths. They keep them clear. The Coast Guard helps maintain this. And this is the information about the Intercoastal Waterway. And the key here for this, and I'll switch over now to the graphics. Give me 1 second here on this. Stop sharing that. Share this. So this is a picture of a portion. I think it's Titusville, and I'm guessing that's Florida. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly where I grabbed this snapshot from. This is the Intercoastal Waterway down to, very detail. The line that's there is in a purple color. It is called the magenta line. That's another quiz question. And the magenta line is what navigations for these ships and boats that are traveling along the intra-coastal waterway utilize. They follow the magenta line, so to speak. It goes in both directions. So there's buoys and other things that tell people where to go. This is where you're going to have bridges that can handle the higher, that either the bridge raises or the bridge is elevated up, so that ships can travel underneath them, that sort of thing. You'll notice there's a cable area on this thing, so they made sure those are well underneath in case for some reason somebody drops anchor. These are all the kinds of things happening, but it is literally like a highway in the ocean. And so obvious any kind of threats or hazards that are in this area could impact the shipping, the economical, the fun that people have towards boating, as well as obviously, of course, the money that goes with it. It's not like it costs you money to travel on this. I don't think there's tolls on the Intercoastal Waterway. I don't believe there are, but certainly people do stop off of it and go into ports and things like that to get fuel or to have dinner or whatever else it is. So this is an economic tourism type of process that has to be maintained. So just something of interest, I thought. Keeping this up and running might end up being an emergency management responsibility, the magenta line. Let me switch back. All right, so we're back. That's one of the graphics that looks a little bit better, obviously, since it's a colored line in color rather than in black and white. So next up on the alphabetics, after H, I, J, K, king tides. So this is a non-scientific term, but it is higher than normal tides. It is not a term uniquely found in the United States. As I noted in the chapter here, Australia, New Zealand, other Pacifics were the ones who originated it. And then here's the definitions and where it comes. But basically the idea is that it's a very high tide, and it's when the moon and the earth are in specific positions from each other. And it is the ones that's pulling the greatest amount of water being pulled from the gravitational force when the moon is closest to the earth. Short answer to a very scientifically long problem. You'll hear this sometimes in weather forecasts when they'll say, storm is coming and it's expected to hit at the same time king tides are in place. That's kind of like, well, wait, let me get my ears perked up. This one may be a tougher one. I think Sandy was one of those when the timing was matched up of being a lunar tide, full tide, full-size tide, king tide, etc. Just to give you some idea of that. I just seem to remember hearing it way back when. Next up is marine weather forecast. So listening to these, focusing on these for an emergency manager is something critical. So it's not just the coastal towns and communities that have shipping, fishing, and other industries. It is everybody. I think this is some critical emergency management intelligence to focus on marine weather forecasts. Next up is rip currents. Here's another graphic I'm going to cover, but basically they could have been included in chapter 11, the prior one that we did 2 chapters ago, I should say, related to swimming and drowning. But they're here because they're basically a ocean threat. Our drowning one was predominantly focused on pools and small rivers and lakes, but rip currents or rip tides are certainly something to be concerned about. I think you can see here, and hopefully if you're in a beach type community, you've seen this graphic already before. The idea of a surf zone where the sand is turning into the beach, and then the water is pulling people out through this area where there's a gap in the sandbars. You can see where the number 3 is. Let me quickly switch over. I have a color version of that one as well too. So this is the color version. So you can see where 3 is that there's a gap in the sandbars or under area, and that's where the water ends up being pulled out. And then so you're swimming in the area of 2, and the next thing you know, suddenly you're in 3, and then before you know it, you're in 4. And if you don't do the right thing, which is trying to swim parallel to the beach, so looking at the horizon of the beach, you're sort of swimming left to right rather than front to back. As you try to, you'll get exhausted trying to swim directly is the point. And obviously letting yourself out into the open ocean water might not be the safest thing to do either, because it's very deep. And there's other hazards out in areas for an example. So that's the thing about riptides. You'll be able to find much more information, safety information, brochures and web searches and things like that if that's something you're interested in learning more about. Back to the book. Next up is rogue waves. So the idea of killer or freak waves, or things that were once thought of as marine folklore, there is actual scientific evidence that they exist. And this is a wave that would be twice the height, twice the size of nearby waves, unpredictable, etc. So there are some science to this. Constructive interference, they form swells, and they start to gain sort of a back and forth motion. And then if those happen in the same way, they'll get to mountainous waves for lasting several minutes. And then that wave energy can also raise them up as well too. When multiple waves join together, they can form. And then they're found in the Gulf Stream, this other current, which I can't pronounce, Agulhas. And then, of course, some of these waves, when they're developed on the wave energy, they tend to be lasting longer than the constructive interference ones. So that's stuff from NOAA, and that's the rogue waves. Next up is sea ice and icebergs. So again, in the ocean, obviously an iceberg breaks off, glaciers and ice shelves that were on the land. If they break into the ocean, those can become challenges. Icebergs, if you we just saw the Titanic exhibit at the Liberty Science Center yesterday. That is obviously the significant impact of an iceberg on shipping, and certainly the idea that this has temperature impacts too. As the sea ice sort of comes off, it is raising the temperature because that ice is no longer there on the land to keep the ocean cooler. As it dissipates off, it's actually raising the temperature because it also reflects solar radiation. So it is it's maintaining cooler temperatures, delaying the melting of the summer. You can read this about sea ice, but basically icebergs is the concern. And that may not only be something up in Greenland or way in the north kind of a thing. Those things can travel as well too, and they can start to get into the Atlantic and impact shipping and ocean travel. As it says, icebergs can damage ships, infrastructures, bridges, and then of course we have if it's an iceberg or ice dam forming on ocean water in the Mississippi that's working its way upward, or in the Delaware Bay, in the case of Jersey, up the Delaware River, or in the New York Harbor, heading up the Hudson. Those are things that could happen. So things to be concerned about as icebergs are forming. Next up is sea level rise. This is the hazards for it. And there's systemic permanent seawater level rise. And it is a climate change impact. Here's all the sort of links to this. It'd be interesting. I should check to see if this still exists. Oh yeah, how exciting! Haven't caught this yet. So this is a pretty cool thing about how you can look at impacts of sea level rise. We can go into New Jersey and look at some of these areas. And then what would happen if, so you can sort of see they do some pictures of what would happen a 5-foot sea level rise. So it starts to move things out. Let's look at Cape May beach houses. Yeah. So here's where the 2-foot, 2.5-foot sea level rise, you still have beach. At 4 foot, no beach. So 6-foot sea level rise, it's starting to hit the buildings back there. This is just some pictures and things that they've done, sort of generate the what ifs, things were to happen. Now, don't forget, this is the idea of the standing sea level rise, not anything on top of which would be the slosh or other types of wave action associated with the storm. So this is just the base level thing. So this is the tool that's there, and it's good to see it's still around. So planning for sea level rise is something I think all emergency managers, especially those in coastal communities, should consider. Seawalls, like dunes, these are temporarily, unlike dunes, I'm sorry, which are temporary constructed of sand. Seawalls are built with more sustainability in them. So they are different materials. Again, it's a catch-22. The higher the seawall, the better it is, but the more view is blocked. So people may not want to live there. And you know, how do you pay for it? Who's benefiting from it in what way? Always challenges. But some of these are projects that I've seen some stuff in New Jersey that have taken shells and put them into metal baskets and then built these seawalls, or they've sunk subways, old subway cars to build seawalls. Lots of things are possible, and just a level of imagination to sort of figure out how to do this and still maintain the biodiversity and the ecology towards it. Next up is slosh, and that is sea, land, and sorry, let me start over again. Slosh is sea, lake, and overland surges. So the key is sea and lake overland surges. Sounds like a quiz question to me. Complex model, pressures, tides, and a whole bunch of other things. It's going to be covered in chapter 14. Standard seawater, this was something interesting. I did not know that there's a difference in how much salt is in seawater depending upon where you are, and that there's actually a standard, like the way that there's, you know, universal standard time in Greenwich, England, or whatever, you know, who keeps the clock? Well, guess what? There's actually a standard out there of how much salt is in it, and then things are measured against that. And this has been done around since 1899. So it's the water that came from natural open water seawater at the Saragossa Sea in the North Atlantic. There's no land near there. So sort of pristine water by water only, seawater by seawater only, I should say. And then they take these containers and put them into England, and then they figure out what it is, and they get a final salinity count somewhere around 35, and that's standard Atlantic seawater. Just unbelievably fascinating thing. But the idea is that we've talked about this before in some of the other chapters. How much salt is in it can determine lots of factors like the weight of the water, the amount of salt plus the temperature can figure out some of the factors for how big the waves are going to be. Lots of science involved in this. So the salinity, or the amount of salt, is something that is important. It's another one of the factors in it. And then, and of course, if a glacier starts to, you know, dilute itself breaks off and gets into the ocean, that glacier is made of fresh water. Does that change the salinity? We'll have to see. Next are tides and ocean currents. So as we talked about, we will talk about next week in the slosh section, tides have a significant impact on sea levels. And then there are water sensors out there, 200 or more along the coastline, plus in the Great Lakes, and then data gives them the tidal predictions for that. So that is where how the sourcing is done, and the NOAA links are here as well too. So the ocean currents and how they move along the Gulf Stream is something to factor in as well too. And that has impacts on not only the weather, but also the severe weather. So tropical storms and other things can be impacted by the Gulf Stream as well. And then here's some quotes about the economic aspects. And again, NOAA being under the Department of Commerce, this is part of what they do, is put together these packages related to trade and maritime transport, something that emergency managers have to be cognizant of, because it's not just impacts to people and homes and things like that. It's also the impacts to the economic aspects of shipping and other things that are involved. So here's their real-time system ports. Feel free to take a look at this. I won't go into detail on this, but this is some systems that connect different models together to help manage the trade movements and ships throughout the world on the oceans. Tropical storms, as mentioned alphabetically, but we're going to cover those next chapter in chapter 14, first chapter of part 5. Next up is tsunamis and tidal waves. So again, when a earthquake generates a tsunami, that's going to be a complex incident. It's not going to be in chapter 14, but well, it is, says it's in 14. I have to find out what that is. I thought it was in 15, but we'll check that out when we get to it. But the complexity of it is what it'll be more details, a little bit more on tsunamis and tidal waves. So they can bring a lot of water, obviously quickly. There's are a couple of videos of those on my website, I think, as well too. And usually, if there's a earthquake in the middle of the ocean, there may not be any impacts to water quality from that, because it's just a question of moving around. But the water quantity issues are certainly the concern. All right. Any quick questions before we switch? Do we go into case studies? Just wanted to double check, folks. Okay, I'll keep going. So Alaska, there was a glacial dam that burst, and that was in 2023, and it happens quite frequently. And there's a Jochen loop, a term. 15 million people get targeted globally, and this hits a lot of hits very specific areas: India, Pakistan, Peru, and China. Bursting glacial ice dams, something to think about. And then we have coastal U.S. communities, high-level sea rise. So this is some of the casework associated with how sea level could rise up to 12 inches in the next, by 2050. So in the next 25 years. 12 inches would be a heck of a lot for lower Manhattan, for example. They have been doing multi-billion-dollar projects to deal with this kind of sea level rise, to raise walls and build blockade things that happen over on the East River. I think I'll try to find some of those links, and there's some recent stories about that I've seen, projects that have just now come to fruition that were funded and started back from Sandy's timeframe. Sierra Leone, here's a story I found about an island known for its fishing villages, and the island is only 300 by 200 square feet. So this thing is a little more than the size of a football field now. But basically parts of the island are submerged when the tide rises. So it's entirely possible with sea level rise, a global sea going up by 1 foot to 3 foot. Technically, by the end of this century, there may not be this island anymore. So that is the Nagaya Island off of Sierra Leone, which I believe is Africa. And the same is true for 2 tribes in the Pacific. So the Kiribati and Tuvalu tribes are facing the same thing. In this case, it's king tides that are coming up. And here's the story about that, and some technical assessment information about that. But just the idea that this sort of rising sea and the tidal impacts that come with it are things that communities need to think about in the long term. Communities everywhere globally. Next up is a saltwater angler story, which is found of New Jersey. So I found this one, and it was that their state is registering saltwater anglers, those who fish on both land and in sea, and how they catch one fish at a time, basically, with a rod and reel, and they're studying their information that they're getting to get data back on how the stocks are of the fish stocks. So the link is for there, and the idea for this is probably more along Mitzi's line, but environmental protection, community-based emergency managers understanding the impact of the environmental and sustainability. That is your economic and your environmental, all the aspects of that positive aspects of fishing can have on a community. And then here's sea level rise in a sovereign tribal nation, Washington State's Quinault Indian Nation, the story there. Similar type thing, but what they did there was they are moving, they're trying to move the village of Tahola. The village is going to be relocated over a 10-year period to go a mile upland and further above sea level because the concern about sea level rise, that the current spot is there. They don't have the money yet completely, and it'll be interesting to see how this is going to get funded in the rest of the future that they need to have it moved. So I have not followed up on this story like I did with the Mexico City story. Something to check on my part. Next up, we have the impacts to the disaster phase cycles. So here again, seawater rise, the flooding issues, and the safety factors. I'm sorry, the protection factors, I should say, against the fact that seawater is corrosive is one of the different things about the preparedness, protection, and prevention aspects for saltwater or seawater, too much seawater compared to too much fresh water. So it's not just flooding protection work, seawalls, dunes, barriers, and things like that, but it's also dealing with potentially underwater electrical things and things where bridges, abutments, and stuff that can be corroded by the salt water. And then, of course, then local marine ecology can be very different than in saltwater situations than it is in freshwater as well too. Different types of things, different plants survive in one thing versus the other, et cetera. The flooding incidents, again, that infrastructure can be impacted, whether it's from tidal or longer term seawater collapses and things and ice dams. There's a lot of response phase work for this. And then this can just be over and over again to communities, especially coastal communities. So there's a lot of repetitive stress involved in that for responders and for communities, for town officials, et cetera. And then, of course, there still is that opportunity for the disaster within the disaster from the response phase. If roads are blocked because they're flooded from seawater, does that make fire response more of a challenge in certain communities? Yes. So things to think about and be concerned with. And then recovery work, when it's not yet at the level of getting federal government support, if any is available, the recovery work still may need to be done. Seawalls, bridge collapses, this could be something that could be very expensive and very time consuming over the long run, especially if there isn't federal assistance to help. Typically towns are self-insured, so they don't have like an insurance company that can go back and say, I need this bridge replaced with my insurance and I'll pay the deductible. And then mitigation work, purchasing homes in recurrent seawater-based areas by government to destroy the home, demolish the home, and restrict its land use is an option. So that Blue Acres type program is something New Jersey actually has some process to as well as other states. But New Jersey, I do know, has a Blue Acres similar to a Green Acres program for that. And then, of course, that mitigation paradox is out there. You start to take too much property off the tax rolls. How does the town deal with that in terms of the economics? So here's our incident command impacts. I mentioned safety officer type things. So those are certainly concerns. There are tons of hazardous open water situations, riptides, ice dams, water rescues. Those are all serious things to be concerned with. We mentioned some of those in the freshwater, too much freshwater chapter last week, but certainly there are additional ones in open water. And of course, the salt water has, again, those same types of adverse impacts that you got to be concerned with relative to corrosiveness. Um, and then those same PIO things for turnaround, don't drown. When it's salt water or seawater that's flooding the streets in communities, it's the same as if it was freshwater kind of a thing. But it might be more repetitive in some of those communities that are used to flooding, and then more recurrent based off of sea level rise. You know, it's happening more frequently, in other words. The intelligence, we talked a lot about this last chapter too, about understanding your topography of your land. For this chapter, it's not only the topography of the land, but the topography of water sources, inlets, sounds, bays, piers, etc. Now you may have new underwater hazards from this, that maybe the oil discharges, the bridge collapse parts, that Francis Scott Key Bridge was a huge amount of underwater debris. I know that I've done some response work when I sit with FEMA and they're supporting the U.S. Virgin Islands. There are small ports where small boats come in on St. Croix, St. Thomas, etc. That St. John is the other one, and they have to check those ports before they have to use LIDAR, radar, sonar type things to make sure that there's not underwater hazards. Because even a small boat can get damaged. You know, the storm came in and sunk a boat, and now it's underwater. You don't want to try to drive your boat over that and ruin your boat. So things have to be checked as part of that. So understanding who was in the harbor beforehand and who didn't, who checked in, who didn't check in, could this boat could have been destroyed or sunk somewhere. Those are all important factors in part of the intelligence. Generally, there's no adverse impacts to finance and admin, again, for seawater hazards, if the community is properly prepared for them. Typical thing I've said in almost all these chapters, if there's search and rescue efforts from flash flooding or other types of heavy sea sudden rises, you may have outside teams coming in and there may be costs to those. So hopefully the community has the plan for it, or has the ability to get support from somebody else higher up, like the county or the state or even the federal government to some extent. But budgeting for those types of things is something that folks should do. Again, generally no impacts to logistics, assuming that the community is prepared with rescue equipment, sandbags, all the types of things that are needed, mutual aid agreements, etc., for flooding, whether it's freshwater flooding or seawater flooding. Flooding is flooding to some extent. And again, same thing for Operation Branch if they're properly done. And there are tons of resources for the planning section for flood risk management and things like that. I have some footnotes here. Those are probably the same ones that were there in play for freshwater flooding. Here's our POETE, the planning, organizing, equipping, training, and exercising aspects. And they are, again, nothing jumps out at me. I'm looking at these just to see if there's anything different than the prior chapters. Just again, remember the corrosiveness salt water can have on metal and electronics. That can impact your equipment that you're using for rescue aspects, as well as monitoring equipment. You had a freshwater river gauge, and then the salt water comes in because of inundation or whatever else it is, that may get damaged. Now you've got a problem when you're checking the river level in the future because of the saltwater impact to something that wasn't normally expecting it to have it there. That's an example of where an impact for the equipment could be. And then here's our impacts to exercise and evaluation. A lot of the scenarios that I mentioned, the case studies, those could be used for exercise examples. And you've got now all this material here. In fact, we were going to cover a little bit of an example in a few minutes with the second tabletop exercise for this class. So here's our chapter key summaries. Um, so this is the water stuff here, the fact that what you have, you should take a look at the prior one if you haven't already to sort of round out the chapters. And then next week we will certainly cover part 5, which is the complex ones. But looking at your own threat assessment and summary performance reporting, and then how your jurisdiction looks at natural hazards in terms of hazard mitigation planning. Those are all kind of things to make sure that flooding is covered. Seawater as an aspect is there too, and all the impacts that we mentioned. So even if you're an inland community, please take a look at what if the saltwater were to come upstream further than it ever has before? What if it was starting to get into rivers and streams and estuaries and tributaries? What if there was a big storm and the water blew its way in? And whatever it is, thinking about the adverse impacts from salt water is something I think everybody in the state should look at some point or another. So here's our notes. Again, it's pretty typical. Just going to quickly skim through these. The references, additional readings. Nothing's jumped out at me as something I would say absolutely everybody should read, kind of a thing. But certainly the links here for those tides and currents and ocean, more of the science and a little more detail. If my explanations weren't concise or complete enough, here is all the basis for this and the background for it, and certainly more examples of groundings of ships and things like that are in these additional reading sections. And then the bibliography is, again, typical what it is. It matches up with my quotes that I made of the references that I had. None of my works are here, so I don't know of anything that's broken. It looks to me like almost everything here is academic, or the government sites, just a quick glance, look pretty tame. I don't think there'd be reason for them to be broken. I didn't really do a lot of DEI conversations here, so that's not going to be an issue. And that's the chapter. So I have 7:45 or 45 minutes after the hour. Let's take a 5-minute break. What we'll do then is I'll switch over to the tabletop. That will not take very long. We're going to kind of just run through it. I'm interested in hearing your own perspective on this. When I wrote this tabletop, I think I put this together in January, early January, if not in December. So my thinking was just to generically do a tabletop, but you'll see that there may be some, with news of last week, there may be some real differences in something. This may be a tabletop you might want to take back with you to your jurisdiction and see if they'd be willing to run it. It may be very pertinent to today's world in the U.S. So we'll reconvene at 7:50. I'll just clear my screens and get things ready. Thanks. Okay, I think that's good. We will switch back to the course material as soon as I can figure out where I put it. Hold on a second. Okay, so we're switched back and we're looking at the tabletop exercise. It is here in the module, the lecture 9 module. If you guys want to download it yourself, you certainly can. Just click that down arrow next to it and you can get your own copy of it. It looks exactly like this. If you've got a PDF editor, I think you can edit it. But generally, I think this is the kind of thing that if you showed this to the bosses just to run a down and dirty, so to speak, tabletop exercise, should have everything that you'd need to do that. Not any kind of formal thing that I would invite partners to or show off or anything like that, because it's got, obviously my name and all that kind of stuff on it rather than yours for it. But so here's what we have. This is a water tabletop exercise. We're not going to take an hour to do this now, but I wanted to go through this. The last one we did was response and recovery. We hear now the other two parts of the phases. This one is preparedness and mitigation. So this is not an ICS tabletop. This is about what are we doing beforehand and what are we doing beforehand, right? So mitigation is the beforehand of the next one after the last one, and preparedness is the work in, for something new that we're not mitigating against, so to speak. It's kind of the same thing in some ways, especially on an all hazards basis. But these are your core capabilities. We're looking at physical protective measures, risk management protection. These are part of the 32 list of core capabilities. So this is where this matches up. So, if there is grant funding or somebody's got to check boxes off of a THIRA to match up to core capabilities, this exercise would match along those lines directly. Our usual objectives: prioritizing life safety, incident stabilization. This is the LIP, and then the ER, the LIPR. So we have economic and environmental, and then preparing for recovery efforts as the last two parts of the priority. So again, life safety always being our top priority. We want to also, there's two other objectives for this exercise, and that is identifying the gaps. There's one other objective, I should say, identifying the gaps, areas for improvement in our POET. That's something I think every exercise really should have, is identifying gaps in the totality of the planning, who's doing what, staffing roles, what equipment are you using, the training that you have, and of course, future exercises, whether they're big tabletops or others types. So this thread is both governmental and non-governmental site flooding. I made it a broad thing so that you could have more partners if you wanted to do this and invite more people in. And some of the folks who are on this class, of course, are not necessarily with government. And then there's two modules. It's a ramp up for a notice incident. And then the second is the response efforts and missions themselves. So here's our standard set of HCEEP criteria, objectives, core capabilities. So again, 3 objectives and multiple spread out core capabilities. So those core capabilities, again, from that 32 list, splits this way pretty easily to see how this works. And again, life safety being something everybody should do, command should be putting as a priority. That's why there's a footnote there. We don't have any observers or facilitators or evaluators for this today, but if you were to take this yourself, you certainly could use that along that lines, and it's a standard sort of way of working through these and almost every other exercise out there. So multimedia update. I don't have a multimedia update, but we'll basically go through this. The standard artificialities and exercise assumptions. There's nothing new about this one. This is pretty much boilerplate language. And if we were to do an AAR, that's, again, something we hope everybody does, but we're not going to do one today. So here's our module 1. And here's the scenario. So a number of factors, including potential sea level rise and climate change, have generated a need to evaluate the elevations of critical infrastructure. This is a real thing, right? We're looking through our community and going, what needs to be elevated? based on what happens if there's more water coming in from um, flooding than what the site was built to handle when it was built. And of course, cost is a factor for this, the time it's going to take to do this, and then what disruptions are going to be in play while we're waiting to do this. Do we have to close a hospital in order to raise it? Probably. But can you do it in sections so that its disruption is minimized? That's the question. And then who needs to be notified at the federal level? Is there any funding? That's going to be an interesting question today. And we'll get a little bit more into that in the second part of this. And then what happens if the work need does not align with federal mandates? How interesting. And I would phrase that exactly how that is, but at the time it was meant to mean something different. But that's a way to look at now. What happens if you're trying to elevate a facility that the feds don't want to elevate it? I can't imagine that happening, but then again, maybe it will. And then is there state funding? Is there how are you communicating this to the public and the media? That's a sort of a level that the state government may have involvement with, as well as a tribal or territory level. And then at the county level, what other non-governmental site impacts? Who else is being impacted around the area that needs to be informed and or participate in projects? How are you dealing with roadways and access points to be clear, kept clear? And then the safety and security of the site itself during any kind of work. What are your plans for that, in other words? And then at the local level, do we have the capability of doing this? And are there training opportunities for this with our local officials to learn different processes, whether it's the finance training, the planning training, the operations training, doesn't matter. Any of those kinds of things. Is there some opportunity for somebody to shadow somebody and help work with them on it? Let me see, how do I have this organized? Oh, this is very short. Okay. So this is when I'm going to ask you folks if you have any thoughts on this relative to preparedness and projects. Are there any in your jurisdictions that you guys are dealing with now that are looking at potentially rising or elevating any infrastructure to protect and prevent the adverse impacts from flooding?
Our town has done some taken some quick steps to fix damage and address flooding in the short term, and they've got an RFP to update all the pump stations and to protect them better. They've had to bring in a trailer generator and get that elevated to keep things pumping. So yeah, so that certainly impacted us, and we're definitely looking to improve that situation.
Was that from Ida?
Yes, all the damage was from Ida.
Okay. Yeah, so that was 2021?
Yes.
Trying to remember it. There's so many I've gone through. It's hard.
Yeah, there was a lot of damage, and they did make all those fixes. And like I said, they've taken some measures to prevent flooding, but they're also looking at a more substantial fix.
Sure. So raising pumping stations or protecting pumping stations, that's a significant one. Do you know if it happened to be all freshwater impacts, or are you in a community where it was a mix of saltwater and freshwater?
All freshwater.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Michael. Anybody else?
I'm not aware of any projects me and Tommy are in the same borough, so I'm not aware of any projects going on now.
Okay. Which borough is that? If you don't mind.
National Park in Gloucester
Oh,
County.
that's right. That's right. I thought that was the coolest name for a borough. I had to look it up.
On the Delaware River, and we have a couple areas of low-lying areas that near the Delaware River tributary. I think it's called the Woodbury Creek, and we do experience a lot of flooding there. we have applied for mitigation type funding with our engineer taking the lead on that. We just haven't really gotten anywhere, but when we get a heavy rain or a full moon or a combination of both, this area floods out continually. And if we don't get out there in a hurry, and Jim will attest to this, that you close the roadway and properly light it up, people will drive right through and be in 4 or 5 foot of water, and then
Oh, gosh.
they wonder why what happened. So
Thomas, that community, wasn't there a history of it being something in the past that like a resort or
back in the day when I was a youngin', I'm 65 now, but back when I was 8 or 10, there were summer homes on the beachfront, and people from Philadelphia would come here and live here in the summer
right.
on those summer homes. And eventually they ended up getting torched, arson, whatever you want to call it, and burnt down. But it was a town where people would come here as a somewhat resort. There used to be an old amusement park
Okay.
to the north of our riverfront. Now it's called Soupy Island, but before that, there were amusements on the waterfront. We had the Lake Island Ferry, which transported 4 times a day all the workers from South Jersey to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. I mean, we had a lot going on. But
Okay. So is any of that considered historic? What's left?
anything what?
Historic.
I don't think so. No.
Okay. I mean, some of the major projects that were done from Sandy, like on Ellis Island and in some of those areas were basically cultural resource, recovery support function.
Well, once the Philadelphia Naval Yard closed down and went private, the ferry went out of business. The amusement park was gone. Why we're called National Park, and people don't understand maybe, is in October of 1777, one of the most important Revolutionary Wars was fought here in this little 1 square mile town.
Oh, that's right. You had a fort there. You had a fort
Yes.
on that side of
We
the
had Fort
Delaware.
Mercer. We were
Yes.
directly across from Fort Mifflin. And the reason it's called Red Bank Battlefield is because the banks were red clay.
Right. Nothing to do with Red Bank in Monmouth County.
No, it was red clay, so they called it Red Bank. And that was where 400 militia soldiers held off 2,500 of the Hessian mercenaries and
Right.
kicked their butt. So that's what we're known for. That's why it's called the Byrd National Park. Everybody's like, "Oh, you live in a national park?" No, it's the name of the town. But
I know. I had to look it up. I did the double take. Like, did he get that right? And I'm like, okay, fine. Yeah. Look at this history and that fort thing was pretty cool.
it's a beautiful park. They still have a lot of memorabilia. And just a year and a half ago, Rowan University Archaeology Department unearthed, by accident somehow, the remains of about 18 soldiers.
Wow.
And they found a coin that was worth $250,000. I think they're still trying. I think they were trying to return the remains to Germany. They didn't want them, so.
Oh, wow. And is that area in any danger of getting flooded or anything from?
Because they were dead, and they were supposed to be returned, but it was.
Oh, okay.
They didn't want any part of it, so. I really don't. I think Rowan University still has those remains, but it was pretty neat to have it was a major news story all across, the mainstream media, but it was pretty neat. So
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, these are the kind of things, big pictures, like long term, what's happening and like the way they build bridges and stuff like that. They're not for 10 years or 20 years. They're for like 100 years. So, what we're going to do now and think about, how we're going to mitigate against the future. It could be some stuff that's got to really be sustainable for some time.
Well, I didn't mean to bore everybody with a history lesson, but it's pretty cool, so.
No, I drug it out of I drug it out of you. I remembered something from my reading, and I'm glad you reminded me
And
about that.
our town logo or whatever is a Minuteman, so.
I actually enjoyed the history lesson also, so thank you.
That was good.
Yes,
That's
thank
really
you.
So next up is mitigation, and again, it's funny that this sort of serendipity of writing this from before. Things have just recently happened this last week. My point to this part of the module was similar to what Michael's doing. They're using funding for projects from prior presidential declarations. I think it's 403. I'm trying to remember the section of the Stafford Act that basically carves out a percentage of what the budget or the funding is done on the response side to the public assistance for categories A through whatever. They say, look, if we spend, whatever, $1 billion, then we'll allocate 100 million, 10%. I don't know, don't quote me on the numbers, but there's something like that associated with mitigation funding. So, and it's not an automatic. The states have to, apply for it, assign it to projects. As Michael mentioned in his community, they're looking at raising some pumps. The RFP, the request for proposals, have to be vetted and all that kind of stuff. The twist that happened last week was that in addition to Stafford Act funding, the Biden administration had created a set of funding in a program called Building Resilient. And by the way, Congress approved this. This isn't, somebody just waving their hand or signing a pen. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, the BRIC program. This was, and I'm showing you, I think you guys can see this now. This is a program that FEMA administers, another one of their grant programs. So in addition to hazard mitigation grant funding and other Stafford type funding, FEMA was tasked with administering this current set of BRIC funding. My understanding from last week, the administrator or the acting official acting as administrator, Cameron Hamilton, issued a memo last week canceling the BRIC program. They obviously are not, they said they're not going to claw back money that was already spent, but they are going to cease payments on anything that was allocated but not obligated, something like that. And I don't know the full things on it, but I wanted to show you an example of one of the BRIC programs in New Jersey. And the point of this exercise is to ask you guys if you're familiar, and I'll get to this in a second, with any BRIC projects in your communities. This is one for Hoboken, and it was a Hudson River project. Hoboken had a number of areas that got impacted by Sandy. And one of the things that they did was they created a Resilient City Park project. So think of resiliency, but part of the Northwest Resilient Park was the key to these BRIC projects is build back better, or whatever you want to call it. There's some of that. They took a former industrial site, turned it into a public park, added multi-purpose athletic fields, basketball courts. That basketball court doubles as a stormwater detention basin. There's actually something underground from it. It's pretty cool. There's a playground, open lawn space, etc. So this was all done. It can detain up to 2 million gallons of stormwater through its structures. That means that the streets are not going to be flooded with an extra 2 million gallons of water. That's a big impact for Hoboken. This is the project. And then this was done, I think it was completed all in 2023. Here's some pictures. So this one on the left is before. You can see the even the park that was built, they had problems. This is part of this was built and it was done before 2023. And then they modified it since then, kept working through the other parts of the project. And you can see the after picture has, the way that they've done the drainage and the other things, even within the area of the park itself, it's not mosquitoes and other types of problems. The flow is working well. The stormwater detention capabilities are significantly improved. There's going to be flood impacts, benefits and things like that. Obviously, the costs for flood damage and other things from the next storm will be reduced, if not eliminated completely. I did see a project. Let me pull this one up. I'm gonna Google it because I just saw it. DM project Washington State. I don't remember where that was. Dang it, I can't find it now. Let's see. Yeah, here's the story. Dismantling the brick program. And I saw something the other day about today. I mean, I should have taken a snapshot of it. It was another state that had a dam project that basically is going to have to be canceled. And I think, and part of it also had a tsunami warning tower and a bunch of other features to it. They were going to reduce. It was a $50 million project, but it was going to reduce flood insurance premiums on the community impact hundreds of homes by more than $1 million a year. So, I mean, it was going to, I don't want to say pay for itself because it's basically taxpayer money versus other money. Those two pools are not the same thing. Point being is that it was going to have some benefits just from the perspective of adverse impacts from flooding. Nothing to do with DEI or anything like that. This is just a program that is effectively being canceled because of its tie to climate change. And so that is a political move that it just happened last week at the end of the week, and you'll probably hear more about it tomorrow. So my question to both groups, Michael and then Thomas and Jim, are you aware of any brick projects in your communities? I am only aware of one, and I think it's in Atlantic County. But I thought there was one in Gloucester, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, currently we're not involved with that.
Okay. And I know the state had some programs that were similar to brick or designed along the lines of brick, but they weren't directly brick funded. So that was another thing. Thomas, anything on your end? Jim, anything from a brick perspective that you're aware of?
No, I don't think.
Okay.
Pretty sure we're any of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll check on Tuesday. I'll do the same thing for the other folks. And I not that I have solutions. I just think it's important to kind of understand that when you lose a funding source, if we lost Shish Gap or UASI funding, that'd be some significant thing. Fire grants. There's a lot of stuff that's happening now that impacts preparedness and prevention, and then protection, of course, and mitigation. If it's not, this is all about the money and where it goes, where it comes from, and who's paying for what and when. That's what a lot of this is based on. So states have to step up and continue to support. And this is going to be something that's going to cost. And it's not going to be fun, and who decides what projects and all that. It's going to be some interesting challenges to think about in the near term. So
your discussion, it's not emergency management based, but the Northeast Tunnel project, which is set for billions of dollars. I wonder how much that'll stay solvent, you know, with how long that project is in phases and the amount of money that's scheduled for it.
Yeah.
Just a question.
No, it is, and it has you're right. It doesn't have an emergency management impact. It's a much more of an economic impact, right? And jobs and tax dollars and all that, and just the flow of cars into the into New York City and out back and forth, and the train. I think all those things are needed. We're just overtaxed on things. The emergency management aspect, of course, is that what happens if that breaks? What happens if the other ones break? Then it becomes the cruciality of needing that. I will tell you, there are massive plans related to a New York City evacuation. An extra tunnel is a really big help. So there's a lot to this. There's the management of it, the same way the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey manages the Lincoln and the Holland. I've been involved with them on exercise planning for both sites, as well as the George Washington Bridge. So those Hudson River crossings, this would just be another one to it. They've got a plan for it. They've got to build out capacity and support for that new tunnel. And that'll have an impact on their overall emergency management. So there are, if you look at that finance, logistics, there are impacts to that tunnel, to emergency management.
And I think actually they're slated to do repairs from Sandy damage. So I think there actually is an aspect to that. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, from the openings, they might have had damage on
Yeah,
both
they
sides.
were flooded. I don't remember the exact damage, but I remember there was significant damage from the Sandy flooding. So
Wow.
I don't, I know that is part of the reparations or the renovations and so forth.
Gotcha. So pretty cool stuff. I have been watching that project. Yeah, not the same level until it gets to more completion, but it's certainly something. I'm looking at, like, even adding a new terminal. JetBlue has a Terminal 6, I think, at JFK. That's a massive project. Oh my God. But there's emergency management impacts to that as well too. Okay, so that's what I have for the book and stuff. I wanted to again remind folks, we'll redo this Tuesday. You guys do not have to attend. Please don't kill yourself. Enjoy the conference if that's where you're at. And then again, reminder that the quiz will be turned on today, I think, at some point, and then it'll be available till April 23rd until 6:29 p.m. Speaking of the quiz, again, a reminder, it is an open book quiz. Some of the points to recall were that droughts can be thought of as a gray rhino threat as compared to a black swan, a yellow tiger, or a pink flamingo. True or false, can droughts occur at the same time as flooding? Well, droughts are a threat and flooding is a hazard. So just by that alone, and the fact that the thing can occur instead of something else, the answer is true. Droughts generate the following adverse impacts to communities around the world. They can impact disease and poverty, business interruption, and then, of course, loss of biodiversity. So if there was a question about that, it would be all of them. When potable water supply is short due to drought, other items that have to be other areas that would be impacted besides points of distribution where water replacement would need to occur include hospitals, the agricultural use for farm animals, and nuclear power plants. So they all need access to clean water, fresh water, beyond what the people who would be consuming it from apartments and houses and whatever else. So the answer to that question would also be an all of the above type of a thing. When it comes to adverse health impacts, when you disturb heavy metals, those are elements which occur naturally, and that in addition to that, the microorganisms and parasites may require missions from the Oil and Hazard Material ESF for helping on the cleanup. So that's not a question of Legionella or silt or carbon. It is heavy metals that are the impact for that. I've said this before, I'm sure, in a number of chapters. Community cannot over communicate hazards associated with threats to their portable water supply system. Emergency managers should be, of course, involved in the full cycle planning, organizing equipment training, equipping, training, and exercising for drownings anywhere in their respective communities, including adjacent jurisdictions such as neighboring communities sharing oceanfront, beachfront, or lake, river, water. Drownings may be something that you have to work together for that full cycle poete. One way that emergency managers can help reduce drownings, encourage everyone, especially socially vulnerable populations, to learn how to swim. That is a true statement. Turn around and don't drown is associated with driving through floodwaters, not riptides or parking on the beach. So, okay. Because of the significant mental health impact of community members and other aspects, a drowning incident will have a very long recovery phase timeline. So it's not a continuous one. It is not a short one. It's not a medium length one. When it comes to the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, it is a very long one. Cubic foot of water weighs around 60 pounds, not 6 or 600, 60 pounds. And I think you can find that in a search pretty quickly on the book if you were doing the back and forth between the book and its quiz. Same thing, by the way, the quiz, 25 questions, 30 minutes to finish it like the other ones. All natural raw water sources, do they flow toward the equator? True or false? The answer is false. There are hills and rivers and things, hills and mountains, I should say, where the water may actually be flowing away from the equator. It's still flowing downstream. So that's a sort of an old wives' tale that all the water flows towards the equator. It's the National Inventory of Dams. That's a good place to find dam locations, who owns them, and other details for your jurisdiction. That's compared to trying to look it up on FEMA or the National Weather Service or the National Institutes of Health. The National Inventory of Dams, or NID. If you're looking for a jurisdiction's flood-prone areas, being familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program in local flood insurance rate maps substantially improves substantial damage concepts, and regulatory floodways are just some of the skills for a floodplain manager. So NFIP stands for National Flood Insurance Program. One area of support that ESF3 Public Works can perform is sandbagging. That is in the protection against adverse impacts of flooding. They can do other things, of course, but when it comes to flooding, sandbagging is something that Public Works can help with. Desalination, true or false, does that produce non-harmful discharge water? The answer is false. I mentioned that before. It's got a lot of extra salt in it, and it harms environmentally the land and the plants, as well as if it's discharged back in the ocean, it can adversely impact the marine life surrounding the area where the discharge water goes. What color line is the main path to the Atlantic intra-coastal waterway? It is magenta line.
Magenta line.
There you go. SLOSH stands for what? Sea, lake, and overland surges. Not sea, land, and over water, or surface water, or whatever I had written in here as other ones. Sea, lake, and overland. Blank are generally described as a wave twice the size and height of nearby waves and are very unpredictable. That would be rogue waves. And then equipment needed for an incident involving too much seeded water needs to include what because of the corrosiveness of salt water. The answer to that is not FirstNet phones, but decontamination capabilities. Sources of emergency management intelligence for both incidents involving too
I
much.
can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk. I need.
Oh, hello. That was cool. Sources of emergency management intelligence for incidents involving too much seawater will need to include the blank of the water source, that is, the inlet, sound, bay, piers, or ports, especially if there are now new underwater hazards, oil or chemical discharges, bridge collapses, debris, sunken or displaced boats, as well as cascading human hazards, power outages, shutting down traffic lights near flooded areas where people are evacuating, fires, etc. The answer to that is topography. So it's not the geology. It's not about what kind of rocks are in the ground or the hydrology, how much water is necessarily there. It's the topography as to what was there in terms of buildings or bridges or traffic signs or whatever else, or now new hazards such as sunken boats or debris, tree limbs, and so forth. That's the topography of what's under the water. The current flow, tidal impact, and what, plus fluctuating water depth, are some of the factors which help a common operating picture. And the answer to that one is temperature. So it's the current flow, tidal impact, and temperature and fluctuating water depth. So not sea level rise, not rogue wave, not humidity, temperature. That one's probably one you could just look up the phrase current flow, tidal impact, and find temperature right after it if you're stuck, or you can write down the word temperature somewhere in your notes. One possible impact to ESF4 firefighting from too much water, flooding, is which of the following? Road salt contamination, people will go to shelters, animals will come to shelters, or fire trucks cannot pass through flooded roadways. It's the last one. Fire trucks cannot pass through flooded roadways. That's an impact to firefighting. It's a pretty easy question. From an ESF 8 perspective, public health, water quantity issues, especially excessive water ones, can generate blank in homes, sewage backups, and other public health hazards. The answer is deadly mold. The other choices are rogue waves. You don't have a lot of those in your homes. Corrosion, that certainly is an issue, but not necessarily one from sewage backups. And then vermin infestations, yes, that could happen much later, but the deadly mold is the big concern from a public health perspective. And then finally, governors of states and territories, as well as sovereign nation tribal leaders can request blank, even in advance of flooding incidents, to fill gaps in their local capacities. And the choices are sandbags, shelters, road salt, or swiftwater flood search and rescue teams. The answer here is that from an EMAC perspective, on the things to fill in advance, it's the swiftwater flood search and rescue teams. That's what comes with your type 1 or type 2 or type 3 IMATs and SAR team, search and rescue teams that are part of the national cadre of state and local groups that have these capabilities. They'll come to your state sometimes in advance of a storm, for example. Getting sandbags and shelters and road salt are all things that typically you have to support yourself at first up front. They're not things that come before the storm arrives. Usually there isn't that much advance notice to get those things in, and typically states are unwilling to pay for those things in advance without knowing that they're going to get a declaration. Even then they're paying 25%, that kind of thing. But typically swiftwater flood search, because of the life safety factors, they are willing to invest in the costs associated with that. So that's our quiz kind of preview, I should say. And again, just a reminder that we will be chatting on this repeat for Tuesday. Other than that, let me double check when our next official class, week 10, will be. Give me 1 second. I'll look at the calendar. I think we are talking about back to the Monday again. Let me double check. And yes, so week 10, that is the first of module 4, chapter 14, will be on Monday the 14th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern. Other than that, I will give you guys back the rest of the evening. Again, if you're at the conference, enjoy. I'm trying to remember if this one's at Hard Rock. I'm trying to remember which place
Yes,
it's at.
Hard Rock.
Hard Rock. Okay.
Yeah, Hard Rock, Mike.
Okay. Enjoy.
I'm gonna look Joe Allen up. He owes me a beer from EM1 class a year
There you
ago.
go. Well, you might find him at the NJEMA table in the main room. He usually hangs out there too.
He's been ducking me for that beer.
Now, if this was the Tropicana, I could tell you where you could have a beer in a good place.
Yeah, I'll find him. Don't
I
worry.
like Re-Rob, but I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you again next week.
Okay.
Take care, guys.
All right, bye.